Football Profits. My name is Christian, and today we're going to be breaking down every player from every game and everything that you need to know, giving you all the information that you're going to need to do your start sit for this week, heading into week 10. And I'm really excited about this. Things are going really well. Do have a bit of a disappointment. Lost by less than a point last week, and it was weird. They kept doing stat corrections. I kept checking, and it was like I was going to win, I was going to lose, I was going to win. It was all over the place. Ended up losing. It was a very unfortunate loss, but let's get to the information, everything you guys need to know. As always, we would say that there will be timestamps down in the description below. And if you have any questions or comments, leave it in the comment section down below. We will try to get back to you. As soon as this video is done, I'm actually going to pop on to our waiver wire video that we posted and answer some comments on there and get caught up with everything that's happening in our FFP community that we've got going on here. For those of you who have noticed already, or if you haven't, Rob won't be with me in this video today. He is down in the cities with my sister. They're at the Children's Hospital doing some tests on her brain, I guess. Sounds like she's going to have brain surgery, so that's crazy. But anyways, he did do research for his games. He simply sent me the information. Now I'm going to be here recording it and giving it to you guys. I'll make sure to let you know what games are his research and what games are mine. But my apologies for those games if the delivery is not as smooth as normal. I don't think I have anything else that I want to talk about. If we don't talk about a guy, you can pretty much safely assume to sit him. But that should be pretty much the wrap up for everything that you guys need to know as we head into these games. And we'll get started off with the first game, the Thursday night game coming up, and Rob's research on that, really updating you guys on everything that you're going to need to consider for that matchup. But let's just get started. All right, guys, so now we're going to break down. First game for the video is going to be the Raiders versus the Chargers. I kind of like this matchup. I think it's going to be fun to watch, especially after the Chargers having a big day versus the Packers. So thank you for the favor, Chargers. But talk about Philip Rivers now to start. He's a guy who's been kind of a disappointment this year in that every other season for the past like 6 or 7 years, he's been a stud quarterback. He's been a good fantasy option. He's put up good numbers, and this year's been a bit of a disappointment, a bit of a step back from that. However, I think that you should ignore that and you should play him this week. I think you should stick with the matchup because the Raiders are a great matchup for him. Now, one of the reasons that he's struggled is coming down to the running game. Austin Eckler was just phenomenal to start the season. Then they get Melvin Gordon back, and they have been heavily leaning on that 1-2 punch in the ground game of Gordon and Eckler. Last game, Gordon and Eckler combined for 32 carries. That's a lot of carries to combine for. Making just simply hard for the quarterback to have a lot of fantasy value when he's not throwing the ball quite as much. But again, I still think you should start him this week based on matchup. The Raiders defense is bad. Not only are they 32nd in the NFL, they are last in the NFL, allowing 297.5 passing yards per game. That's a lot of yards to allow, by the way. That's almost 300 yards a game. You're essentially giving up every quarterback who faces you a bonus, so that's crazy. They give the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And man, the last few games have been rough to them. Not just this season as a whole, but of the last 3 quarterbacks that have played them, 2 of them have gone over 400 yards, and those 3 QBs have combined for 11 touchdowns to 1 interception. That right there is pretty simple numbers when you break it down. Just a bad defense and a great matchup. I definitely think you should play Philip Rivers this week. Move on now to the running game. Bit of a different situation. It's a bit of a mess going on there, but we got Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler. Now, I think that Melvin Gordon has actually surprised me this year. I think he's starting to pick things up a little bit. Last year, he was a top 6, top 5 running back. He was elite. He was great in 2018. That hasn't been the case this year. Of course, we break down a few things. One, just missing time. You can't compare his stats to other running backs. But then he comes out with a 2.25 yards per carry, really struggled. He started to turn that on recently and just getting the rust off. Being a running back in the NFL, being in football shape is so important, and it's impossible to do when you're not playing against these other guys. But 2 games ago, he had 3.9 yards per carry. Last game, that went up to 4 yards per carry. So he is slowly getting his yards per carry up and getting back to the running back that he used to be just last season. It wasn't that long ago. And the touchdowns are there. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. That's some pretty solid numbers, and that's not outside of the norm for Melvin Gordon. I think that trend could very well continue. In fact, through the first 3 seasons of his career from 2016 to 2018, he had 38 touchdowns in just 41 games. So this is a touchdown machine. It's just sort of what he does. Now, this isn't a phenomenal matchup because the Raiders' defense is fairly solid against the run. They're currently ranked 7th against the run, allowing just 92 rushing yards per game. But with all of that being said, I still think you got to play Melvin Gordon. With his propensity to find the end zone, I just like him. For me, he comes in as a solid RB2, not yet got back to his RB1 status, but I could see that happening by the end of the season. Austin Eckler, phenomenal running back, extremely talented. Gordon has been getting the touchdowns. He's been getting the red zone, the goal line carries. That's not a surprise to me, but it definitely does still affect the fact that Austin Eckler's got less value than he did. He averaged 14 carries per game when Gordon was out. He's averaging just 5.6 carries per game now that Melvin Gordon is back. So that is, of course, a major hit to him. However, he has been averaging a little bit more in the passing game since he is back. I don't know what that is due to, but that definitely helps him a little bit. Currently, he has been just phenomenal, and he is number one in catch percentage among running backs with 96.5% catch percentage. In PPR leagues, you got to start him as a low-end RB1. He is a PPR stud. He is phenomenal. In standard leagues, I would call him a low-end RB2 or an RB3 or flex play if you're in a league with 14 teams or less. That's sort of the rundown with that situation. He'd be even higher, of course, if Gordon was out, but that's the world we live in right now. Keenan Allen, he's a guy you got to start in most leagues as probably a wide receiver 2 or 3, probably a low wide receiver 2, medium wide receiver 3. He started off the season phenomenal. He was averaging 14 targets, just shy of 10 catches, 135 yards, and a touchdown per game in the first 3 weeks. But since then, he's been quite disappointing, averaging 7 targets, 4 catches, 42 yards, and 0 touchdowns. The production has just been so limited. And one thing that me and Rob were talking about earlier, because I'm reading off his notes, but one of the things that he was mentioning was when you look at the game film, when you break down the scripts and you just watch the Chargers, in years past, the check down, the safe option, the safety blanket, the boom, go to this guy so I don't get sacked or so nothing bad happens was Keenan Allen. This year, you get Hunter Henry back, who can very well do that. He's been very productive. And you've got Austin Eckler, who's really kind of moved into that role. And so I definitely think that that's hurt him a bit. Oakland gives the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers, so this is a good matchup, and it could very well be the week that Keenan Allen recovers from that number. I definitely think you got to play him as a wide receiver 2 or a very good wide receiver 3. But Mike Williams, this is another situation that's a little bit interesting. I don't have a whole lot to say on him. But he's a guy, since his bye week in week 4, he's had 5 games and he's averaged 75 receiving yards per game. Now, I don't think he's caught a touchdown all year, which is, of course, very concerning, especially for a guy who had, I believe, 11 touchdowns the season before. So you definitely have to wonder where that switches from. I would call him a wide receiver 3 or flex play based on the fact this is a good matchup, could be a good game for him. But move on now to Hunter Henry. He's a clear start. This guy's a top 5 fantasy tight end. Heading into 2018 before he got hurt, a lot of people felt like that. I personally felt like he could easily be a top 5 guy. And it just didn't happen because of the injury. But now he's finally healthy and playing. There's no arguing with his numbers. You got to play this guy. Another guy that's kind of sneaky under the radar due to injuries is Michael Badgley. After missing time due to injury, he is back, and he had a phenomenal day. He hit 4 field goals and 2 extra points. Last season, he hit 93% of his kicks. Those are like Justin Tucker-like numbers. Those numbers are phenomenal. Keep in mind that Justin Tucker was, by Bill Belichick, called the greatest kicker of all time. Like, that's some great praise. So Michael Badgley has been a phenomenal kicker. I definitely think you have to play him if you have the chance. Chargers defense, I would sit Oakland. They take care of the ball. They're well coached by John Gruden, giving the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses. In fact, they've allowed 1 or 0 sacks in 6 games this season. So teams just aren't getting after the quarterback. That much is for sure. And while we're on the quarterback, let's talk about him, Derek Carr. Derek Carr, we loved his matchup last week. We said start him last week. That is sort of the opposite. We're really going the other way this week. Maybe that is a surprise to some people, but I wouldn't play Derek Carr this week. The Chargers give the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They've been a good defense. Heck, they just shut down Aaron Rodgers, and they're giving up. They are 5th in pass defense, allowing only 208 passing yards per game. This could be a very, very strong week for the running game. I could see them leaning on Josh Jacobs a lot. So let's talk about Josh Jacobs, who I think you have to play. Now, I don't know if you guys know Pro Football Focus. They're a website, a company that does professional football statistics. I believe they do some college football as well, but they do NFL stats, and they've got some of their own measurements and metrics that they use to determine how effective a guy has been. And they rank Josh Jacobs as the #1 running back in the NFL right now. Now, 3 of the last 4 weeks, he's had over 100 rushing yards 3 times this season. He's had 2 touchdowns. His yards per carry of 4.9 are excellent. Start him. This guy's a stud. He is phenomenal. Move on now to their wide receivers. Kind of an opposite situation here. Not a lot to like. Tyrell Williams, I would sit him. After 5 games with 5 touchdowns, that streak was broken last week, and now we're coming into a tough week. He's got 4 consecutive games with only 3 catches, averaging only 5 targets. So he's not getting enough volume, and then you throw in the fact that this is a tough matchup this week against a pretty solid Chargers defense, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Hunter Renfrow, he's had 2 good games or 2 good weeks in a row where he's been very productive, but he moves into a tough matchup. He's a rookie wide receiver, and he's only had 2 good games. That's simply not enough for us to trust him, so I would sit him as well this week. Darren Waller at tight end, you got to start this guy. We just talked about how tough this is a matchup for him. However, that's not so much a problem for a guy who leans heavily on high volume, getting a lot of targets, and just simply being used a lot. It's funny, he's a guy who came out of nowhere, 4 years in the NFL, nobody heard a thing about him basically. Boom, he just breaks out. Goes from some guy that, even as fantasy experts, we've heard of him, but really haven't bothered to just dive into his metrics. And at this point, love this guy. Right now, only Will Disley, Kittle, and Hunter Henry have ranked better offensively by Pro Football Focus, so they've been very effective. I would sit their kicker, Daniel Carlson. I would sit their defense. Ooh, man, their defense has struggled. They're 28th in fantasy scoring, only scoring 3.75 fantasy points per game. I would sit the Raiders defense. And sure enough, that is my wrap-up for the Raiders versus Chargers. If you guys have any questions, make sure to let me know. And I will continue on to the next game. Wow, this has been a long wrap-up. All right, now we get to talk about the Lions versus the Bears. Why not start off talking about the Lions and Matthew Stafford? For me, he is a must start. Yes, the Bears allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But let's break that number down. They've averaged just 18 points a game over the last 5 games. The reason that quarterbacks aren't scoring a lot of fantasy points against them is they don't need to. If you score 20 points against the Bears, congratulations, you got to win. That's basically been the trend so far this season. That's the way it's been, especially the last 5 games. The Bears offense has struggled, and it has severely hurt their team. Guess it's given a boost to their defensive numbers, but also it's certainly hurt them by keeping them on the field a lot. This is a guy who over the last 3 games is averaging 370 passing yards and 3.3 touchdowns. He's a must start. It's that simple. One of the reasons he is a must start is the terrible running back situation Detroit has right now. So I'm going to save everyone some time. I don't care who he is. I don't care how much of a gut feeling you have. Don't start any running backs from the Lions backfield right now. That much is plain and simple. Kenny Galladay, you got to start this guy. Yes, it's a tough matchup, but he's got 3 touchdowns and 255 receiving yards in the last 2 games. I like him. He may not come in as a wide receiver 1, but he is a good wide receiver 2. Marvin Jones. Marvin Jones is an interesting situation because if you're looking for a high upside but a high risk player, Marvin Jones is the guy to start. If you're looking for a safe option, Marvin Jones is probably not the guy to go with. Now, all in all, I would say you got to play Marvin Jones. But I do want to let you know that there's some risk there. He's a guy who, when you read his numbers, it's funny, he had 101 yards and a touchdown off 3 catches, great day. Then he had just 3 catches for 77 yards, then 2 catches for 17. But then he had 10 catches for 93 yards and 4 touchdowns. And the next week he follows it up with 4 catches for 22 yards. And then the next week he follows it up with 8 catches, 126 yards and a touchdown. This guy is all over the place. If you're willing to accept the risk, start Marvin Jones even in a tough matchup. However, I'm not sure about that risk. Certainly makes me nervous. I don't happen to own him in any leagues, but I'd be curious to hear from some of you Marvin Jones owners out there how you feel about that risk. I certainly feel like it's probably worth putting up with, especially with the way that defense and that running game has been going. Danny Amendola, the 3rd wide receiver on that team. It's tempting to talk about maybe playing this guy. 3 games this year. He's had at least 7 catches and 95 yards. He's been very productive in some games, but the rest of the games he has been basically nobody. In PPR leagues, you can play him as a wide receiver 3 or flex play if you're quite desperate. But I don't know how many of you are going to be desperate at this point. We're starting to hit the point in the season where the only people who are watching have fairly solid rosters. And so I think that's a very situational, dependent situation. I don't know what that sentence means, but you get the point. You have to be in a large league and to be desperate for a PPR wide receiver. Otherwise, I wouldn't play him. TJ Hawkinson, sit this guy. It's a good matchup against the Bears, give him the third most fantasy points to tight ends, but he's a guy who basically on average this year is going to get you 3 catches and 30 yards. That's just not enough for me. I would sit kicker Matt Prater, and I would sit the Lions defense. They have scored just 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games total, and that includes a touchdown versus the Giants. You take that away, they have 1 fantasy point in 3 games. That is awful. We'll flip sides now to the Bears and Mitchell Trubisky. I'm going to save everyone some time. Sit Mitchell Trubisky. Move on now to David Montgomery. I think you got to play him this week as an RB2. That Bears team is going to really lean heavily on the run. He's got 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, including 2 rushing touchdowns last game to a very tough Eagles run defense. They are going to absolutely lean on the run, and they're in a matchup against the Lions, giving them the most fantasy points to running backs out of any other team in the NFL. Montgomery is a guy you got to play this week. Allen Robinson. This is a poor guy. He has been very productive. We were right at the beginning of the season. We said that this guy is a very good wide receiver, but the last few weeks have been a struggle for him. I think you got to play him, especially in PPR leagues. He's been a stud. But again, the last 2 games, he's combined for just 6 catches for 68 yards. I think that is a bit of a fluke, and a lot of that is caused by terrible quarterback play. But the Lions giving up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. I still think you should play him this week. All other Bears wide receivers haven't been productive enough, and with the quarterback issues, I wouldn't start any other Bears wideouts. I would sit their their tight end Trey Burton, and Eddie Pinheiro, their kicker. I would sit him. He's averaging just 5 fantasy points per game over the last 4 games. That is due to the offensive struggles. You got to avoid him. In the Bears defense, I would sit. They haven't scored more than 6 fantasy points since week 4. That is a good defense, but right now that team is banged up, struggling. I don't think you should play the Bears this week. A little bit quicker than my last game. That is my wrap-up for the Bears versus Lions. Let's continue on with our next game, and hopefully this video will get done at some point tonight. All right, now we're going to talk about the Ravens versus Bengals. Rob did the research for this game, so thank you, Rob. I'll try to read off his notes and hopefully it'll make sense the way I read it. But break down first off Lamar Jackson in this game. You got to start this guy. Not only did he play against the Patriots last week, who are probably the best defense in the NFL, or at least one of them, he dismantled that defense, made it look like it was a cakewalk. It was nothing for him. And then you take that into a game versus the Bengals, allowing the most yards per game, 32nd in the NFL, allowing 435 yards per game. Lamar Jackson's a quarterback you got to start. In fact, did you know among quarterbacks, he is currently number 1 in fantasy for points per game scored? Again, that's among quarterbacks, but that's a huge stat. You definitely got to play him this week. Another guy you got to play is Mark Ingram, 5.1 yards per carry, ties his career best. He has been very effective. Now, he's averaging just 14 carries per game. That certainly makes me nervous, but you know what? This is a guy who relies a lot on his touchdowns. He's a bit more of a standard league running back than he is a PPR league running back. He is on pace for, I believe, 28 catches on the season, so that's moderate, but really the touchdowns and the goal line carries is what matter in a high-octane offense. And then you consider they're playing the Bengals, who are worst in the NFL, allowing 177 rushing yards per game. Ingram is a guy you'd be dumb not to play this week. I think it's a great matchup, and this week I play him as a strong running back 1. I like him. Gus Edwards. Rob wanted me to throw him here. This is his research, what he said. This could very well be a blowout in favor of the Ravens, of course. If that happens, there's a solid chance Gus Edwards goes out and gets 10 to 12 carries. He has some sleeper appeal. If you're in a daily fantasy league and you want to get the cheapest running back available, this is one of those shots you could take. I know a couple weeks back, more than a couple weeks back now at this point, but back when Dallas played Miami, he did that with Tony Pollard. There's certainly a time and a place for a backup running back to have a big day. But we would probably consider Gus Edwards an RB4 at this point, so don't start him in most leagues for that sake. Marquez Hollywood Brown, this guy currently comes in. It's an interesting situation because Bengals currently allow the 11th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but when you allow the most rushing yards per game, your offense stinks and you're not scoring points, it's not the fact that they've got a good pass defense. It's the fact that the rest of their team sucks so bad, teams ain't throwing the ball against them that much. So I think he comes in as a wide receiver 3 start this week and a wide receiver 4 in PPR leagues. He's just not a guy you can depend to have a lot of catches. He's just not. And that's unfortunate, but he can make some big plays, so I definitely think he is playable this week. Tight end Mark Andrews, you got to play this guy. He's currently 7th in tight end scoring. And with really just the shallowness and lack of depth at the tight end position and the insecurity and uncomfortability with the talent that's out there, you got to play this guy. He's a safe and solid pick this week. Justin Tucker is a kicker you got to start. I mentioned it earlier, but Bill Belichick called Justin Tucker, the greatest kicker of all time, which is crazy. This guy's career is not even over, and what I would consider the best coach of all time calls you the best kicker of all time. Mind you, Bill Belichick's had some good kickers over his time coaching, and so that is high praise. He is a must start pretty much every single week. As far as the Ravens defense goes, they're not as good as they've been in the past, but this is a great matchup. I think you should play them. They're going to be facing off against Ryan Finley under center, who I'm just going to go on a limb here and say is probably going to have a rough first day in the NFL. But come on now to the Bengals, talk about their situation, and of course, why not talk about it? Ryan Finley going to be getting his first start. I'm going to call this a bad game for him against a good defense. I would sit him. Joe Mixon. Here's what Rob wrote, and again, this is tough for me trying to deliver this information to you guys, as I've literally never read this before, but he wrote, I would be starting him mostly due to so many teams on a bye week and injuries, but he said, I wish I didn't need to, and that's exactly what really sums up this situation. This year has been a disappointment for Joe Mixon. It hasn't been great, it hasn't been phenomenal, but you start to throw in injuries and bye weeks. Mind you, 6 teams are on bye weeks this week. I almost think you have to play him simply off of just not having other options. There are a few of you who have got enough depth to be able to play this guy, or to be able to sit this guy. But I'm going to give the advice that most of you will play him. It, of course, as always depends on your situation that you're in. The Ravens do give the 6th fewest fantasy points to running backs. So that is really where we're at with Joe Mixon. It is a tough situation. I feel bad for the guy because I think he's a very effective running back. I think he's a very good running back, but his team has really screwed him over. I'd love to see what Joe Mixon could be doing on another offense and another team, but that's really all I got to say on that as I'm just reading off Rob's notes. Continue on now to the wide receivers. The Ravens give the 11th most fantasy points to wide receivers. This comes down to the fact that Ravens score a lot of points and keep teams trying to throw the ball against them, trying to score points to keep up, so that benefits them very well. Now, Tyler Boyd, he will benefit greatly from A.J. Green's return. He's going to get a lot of less attention from defensive backfields, probably won't be playing the number 1 corner this week. Of course, that's if A.J. Green returns. Right now, reports are that he will be returning this week, and he is an all-pro talent. He's phenomenal, and he's coming off. He had a huge game last year. I think he had 3 touchdowns in the first half against the Ravens last year, so it's definitely something to consider, but I'm not huge on him. Rob, here's what he said. I think you should start him as a low wide receiver 3 in typical leagues. I would typically wait till next year as one of those situations where next week. I'd love to wait and see what he's done. At the very least, you have to monitor this guy till at least Saturday to see how his practices have been going. Now, currently, Tyler Boyd, he is currently 28th in wide receiver scoring this season. In 6 of his 8 games, he has had double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. I think you got to play Tyler Boyd this week as a wide receiver 3, just considering I think they're going to be throwing the ball a lot, and he could get some volume. Again, PPR leagues gets those catches. Tyler Eifert finally had a good game last week. Still don't start this guy. Before that, he had 5 straight games in which he had 2 catches or less, and in that same span was averaging 17 yards receiving per game. He is a must-sit. I would also, let's save some time, sit their kicker, sit their defense, and boom, that was the Bengals versus the Ravens game. You always hate to count a team out. They always say any given Sunday, any team could win, but I'm definitely heading into this game, going to have to give a major edge to the Ravens. They look great right now. They really do. They just dismantled the Patriots. It's funny, actually, because if you guys, anybody who's been really watching football and paying attention over the last 5 or 6 years, 10 years, 12 years, honestly, no matter how good the Patriots are, when the Ravens play them, that is a close matchup. It seems almost like a division rivalry, but it's not. But anyways, let's move on now. Let's get to the next game. So we got Bills versus Browns, and let's talk about the Bills first and Josh Allen. Start this guy. Browns give the 12th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and he's got 21 or more fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. Josh Allen is a quarterback you should be starting. He's gotten a massive boost from the play of Devin Singletary, who's another guy you should definitely consider starting this week as a running back too. Here's what I'll say right now. Now, last game he had 20 carries for 95 yards and a touchdown, plus he added 3 catches for 45 receiving yards. He looked very phenomenal. I'm going to tack on this week. I don't know if he's going to get 20 carries. My estimation is probably 15, 16 carries. That was his career high in carries. Now, he's played in 5 games throughout his career, so there's definitely a lot of room to grow and develop and for him to work into that. But what are the odds that a guy hits his career high in carries and follows that up the very next week? Who knows? I feel like there's just not enough safety with this guy, but it's still a good matchup. He keeps himself out there in the passing game, and the Browns give the 8th most fantasy points to running back. So I don't think he's going to get quite as much volume, but I still think he is a playable running back, probably an RB2 this week. Frank Gore on the other side, sit this guy. His yards per carry have dropped from over 5 to just around 3.5. His carries have dropped 2. He's just been seriously hurt over the last few weeks. At 36 years old, you have to wonder if age is catching up to him. And you also have to wonder if the Bills are going to keep rolling with their hot, young stud Devin Singletary. But move on now. John Brown at wide receiver. This is a guy I'm going to call a wide receiver 3, medium to high end. He's averaging about 5 to 7 catches a game and 70 yards. That's pretty much a normal game for him. Of course, that 5 to 7 catches is pretty good in PPR leagues, and that's really where I feel the most secure about him, because he has only 2 touchdowns on the season. But he is a big part of that offense, and if the Browns can even keep in it at all, that's definitely going to mean that he's going to have a fair amount of targets and catches this week. You should sit their kicker and their tight end, Dawson Knox and Steven Hauschka. Sit both those guys in. I would consider starting the Bills defense. The Browns give the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. That Browns team has struggled, especially on offense. So that could very well be a good week for the Bills defense. But that's my wrap up for that side. Let's move on now, and we can talk about the Browns. Baker Mayfield, sit this guy. Bills give him the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and this guy's got 7 touchdown passes on the season. That's less than 1 touchdown pass per game, and in fact, he hasn't thrown more than 1 touchdown pass in a game at all this season. Talk about a sophomore slump. Baker Mayfield has been just haunted by the ghost of off-season past and the fact that the Browns organization did not rally around him and go out and get him an offensive line. I think one of those situations where you get really hyped up about your quarterback, so you go out and get him a big wide receiver like Odell Beckham, and you forget that this guy needs 2 seconds to throw the ball. And you know what? That has been a serious factor in hurting his value. But Nick Chubb, you still got to start Nick Chubb this week. Bills give the 13th most fantasy points to running backs. A lot of games against the Bills are just running the ball all day long, old school football. Last week, and here's how effective he has been. Last week was really the worst, really one of the worst weeks that I've seen Nick Chubb have in a very long time. He had 20 carries for 65 yards, but he also tacked on 4 catches for 26 yards, and that was a bad week against the Broncos team. Could you imagine now if he bounces back and has anything better, if his running game is a bit more effective, because that was a bad yards per carry, but if he gets 20 carries and has a fair yards per carry, that'll be 90 to 100 rushing yards, and then you add on another 4 catches for 25 yards. That's a good day. I think you got to play Nick Chubb. Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry. Now, the Bills give the 7th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, so that is a really tough situation. I think you have to play both these guys as wide receiver 3s. They are very identical. I think Odell Beckham Jr. is the better wide receiver, but he also plays the better cornerback. And so all in all, they typically look like the same wide receiver statistically, where they're going to each get you about 5 to 7 catches and about 50 to 80 yards in range. That's sort of a standard range for them as far as what you're going to see. I think you got to play those guys, but I don't have massive expectations for them. I would sit Ricky Seals-Jones unless you're desperate for a plug-and-play tight end this week. He's had 2 good games and 3 bad. Austin Seibert, their kicker for the Browns, sit him and sit the Browns defense. And that's my wrap up for this game. We're going to continue on with this video. Is certainly turned out to be a long video. My apologies for that, but hopefully we are really honestly I'm hoping that we're succeeding in my number 1 goal for this video. In fact, probably my only goal for this video is that we get you guys all the information that you need. But let's continue on now with our next game. All right, guys, now I will be talking about the Chiefs versus Titans, giving you Rob's information, his breakdown. First things first, there's a lot of talk right now. Sounds like Pat Mahomes will be playing this week. That's not a guarantee. Any smart owner would continue to check and monitor his health throughout the week, so I'm going to put that out there. But if Pat Mahomes plays, I'm going to save you some time, start him. On the other hand, if Matt Moore plays because Pat Mahomes is out, I think you got to sit him. And here's why. He's averaging 19 fantasy points per game in his starts. Now that's good, but that's against the Packers and against the Vikings, two teams whose defenses surprisingly struggled a little bit. They did, and whose offenses put up some points, right? And so that is a situation where I think that was actually pretty good matchups for him. Not great, but you come into a game against the Titans, who are currently 7th best defense in the NFL, allowing just 18 fantasy points per game. And the Titans aren't going to score a lot of points against you. I mean, that's the thing. They're allowing 18 points per game, but heck, you score 20 points against them, you win. I don't think there's a lot of room for Matt Moore to have a big day, but there is a lot of room for Matt Moore to suddenly get shut down by a good defense and have a bad day. I look towards a quarterback with higher upside, but again, there's a very good chance Pat Mahomes could be playing this week. In fact, there is a chance he was going to play last week. He didn't. That was probably the right call, but I'm confident that he's going to play this week. That could very well go terribly wrong. But anyways, we'll continue on now. Damian Williams, LaShawn McCoy. Titans giving up the 11th fewest fantasy points to running backs, so it's already not a great matchup. And McCoy's really struggled. He had taken a hold of that role, getting the majority of the carries and being the back in that situation. But then he starts to fumble the ball a lot. Damian Williams comes back from his injury really predominantly at a big 91-yard touchdown run last week. He's looked very effective. I have to imagine that this is the guy right now. And I think a lot of people are going to agree with that. I'm a little bit surprised that he's been able to do that because LaShawn McCoy was very effective other than the fumbles. But here's what I'll say right now. It's still really quite a bit of a running back by committee system. It still makes me nervous, but they always say play the hot hand, and I fully believe that in fantasy. If it were fantasy playoffs, I might say something different, but I'll say right now Damian Williams comes in as a low-end RB2 or flex play. Not a guy that I love, but he is playable. There's just a lot of risk involved, and that's what makes me nervous because other than the fumbling, LaShawn McCoy has been more effective on the ground. He was averaging over 5 yards per carry, and I guess for me the question is how many weeks until the Chiefs and Andy Reid forget about the fumble and work LaShawn McCoy back into the system? How many weeks until that happens? So that's what we know right now. I feel like he's definitely worth a play for many people who are desperate at running back with so many bye weeks and injuries. He's got to find his way into starting lineups in a lot of leagues. But I do want to temper expectations. It's not a great matchup, and I'm just waiting for the week LaShawn McCoy out-carries him again. We'll see when that happens. It could be a while. Tyreek Hill, he's been phenomenal. He comes back, and then Pat Mahomes leaves, and he's got Matt Moore throwing the ball. It didn't matter. His production has been there. He's been phenomenal. Start as a solid wide receiver 1. Sammy Watkins, sort of a same situation. Start him as a wide receiver 2. Minus week 1. Well, so week 1 he was phenomenal. Minus week 1 he hasn't been nearly as good, but you still got to start this guy. When you consider the recent struggles as a high wide receiver 3 sort of range. Again, probably before when it's at a wide receiver 2 like I just mentioned, but then you look back and realize the last few weeks just haven't been quite as good for him. Travis Kelce, he's a top 5 NFL tight end. Start this guy, especially if Pat Mahomes is back. And Harrison Butker, you got to play this guy. Don't even think twice about it. Kansas City Chiefs, they've had 3 good games and 5 below average fantasy games. The Titans do allow the 11th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Their offensive line has allowed more sacks than any other offensive line in the NFL. And if there's one thing that the Chiefs are good at, it's getting after the quarterback. So if you're looking for a risky start this week, a risky plug-and-play option to put in there that you don't love but you'll put up with, you'll deal with, it's got to be the Chiefs versus the Titans this week. Flipping sides now to Ryan Tannehill. Chiefs give the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. He's averaging over 20 fantasy points over the last 3 starts that he has had. He has looked great. If Pat Mahomes is back, that Chiefs team is going to put up points. They're going to score and force Ryan Tannehill to play catch-up, throw the ball a lot. Now, if you need to stream him due to injuries and bye weeks, do that. He is worth a start. He's not a guy I love. He's not a fantastic play, but he is worth a start based on this matchup. It's funny, the Ryan Tannehill, the fantasy points, he scored 20 fantasy points a game over the last 3 games, but it's been ugly. However, I guess in the end, I don't care where the numbers are coming from as long as the numbers are getting there. So Derrick Henry. You got to play this guy. Kansas City allows the third most fantasy points to running backs, and he has been just a very effective runner. I think that when you look at this Tennessee team, they're going to do their very best to not get into a shootout. They're going to run the ball a lot. They're going to slow down the game. And so I definitely like him a lot. Now, when you subtract a 4-game stretch in 2018, he has been really a plower, a big running back. He's been very physical, but he's not the sort of guy that's going to go out there and have a lot of catches and be a big PPR stud. But his yards per carry are usually around 4, and a lot of his a lot of his value comes from volume and goal line carries. So do note that in PPR leagues, his value drops consistently, and he's getting just over 1 catch per game. I know that there will be some of you in PPR leagues like myself who have got 3 good options at running back, and you may need to bench him. He is not start in all leagues, but he is start in most leagues. That's what I would say. Corey Davis. Rob wrote this in his notes, so I'll say it. Is it time to declare this guy, this first-round pick in Corey Davis, a bust? It certainly feels like that. He's only had 2 good games this year. Otherwise, he's averaging 44 receiving yards a game, and currently he's got to come in ranked as like a wide receiver 5. That's just the way it seems right now. A.J. Brown. Now, this is an interesting matchup. The Chiefs allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. He's a rookie. He's been very good in some games. 4 games he's been good. The other 5 games he's averaging just 2 catches, just on 4 targets and 18 yards. I would say sit Brown. For me, he comes in as a wide receiver 4 at this point. Again, even if the Chiefs do put up a lot of points, for whatever reason, they managed to stop wide receivers quite a bit. It's running the ball and throwing to your tight end and throwing to your running back out of the backfield. That's the sort of thing that the Chiefs struggle with. But anyways, we'll move on now. Adam Humphries coming as a wide receiver 3 on this team, at least as of right now. Seems like a fair wide receiver for that team. He's making some good catches. He's a good slot guy, but he's not worth starting in fantasy. Now we've got Jonnu Smith or Delanie Walker. Now Delanie Walker said that he feels comfortable enough to practice. It sounds like he's going to be back, and he really wants to be playing. And Jonnu Smith is a good tight end too. Definitely outside of the top 12. Here's what I'd say right now. It's an uncomfortable situation because if you don't have Delanie Walker, Jonnu Smith plays, but he's not Delanie Walker. He hasn't been absolutely fantastic, and I would see him in maybe that 10 to 15 tight end range as a possible start. But if Delanie Walker comes back, who do you play? Because I feel like those guys split roles a little bit. If Delanie Walker's anything less than 100%, so it's a whole weird situation. I would look for some other options before you fall back to this Tennessee Titans tight end situation, in which case I would, again, continue to monitor that injury with Delanie Walker. Excuse me. I tell you what, one of the hardest things in the world is to read Rob's notes and try to deliver it like I've already read it before. But kicker Ryan Suckup, normally he's a solid kicker, but he missed 3 kicks in his first week back from being injured. So I'm going to say sit this guy. I think that injury has messed with him. Some time off has messed with him. I'm going to avoid him this week until we've seen he's really gotten back up on his high horse and he is the kicker that he used to be. Don't forget, he was a very good kicker before, but right now that's not what we're seeing. As well as I would sit the Titans defense if they're playing Pat Mahomes. If they're playing Matt Moore and you want to gamble, you want to take a risk, you could. I don't think they're a great play this week, but that's my wrap-up for this game. Feels like this video is taking forever. My apologies. I'm just going to say that after every game at this point, but let's continue on now. I believe next we get to talk about now we'll talk about the Saints versus the Falcons. I want to start off talking about the Saints, so I can talk about Drew Brees, who has been absolutely electric this season. But he's really only had 2 full starts this season, 2 full games. And in those full games, he scored 25-plus fantasy points in both games and thrown for over 370 passing yards twice. Then you come into Atlanta, you're playing the Falcons, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Drew Brees is a must start. Alvin Kamara at the running back position. He is questionable, yet expected to return. He's an obvious start if he plays, but if he doesn't play, you must start Latavius Murray. Essentially, we're looking at a team that has got such a high-octane offense, such an effective team behind Drew Brees under center and Sean Payton calling the plays that no matter who that lead back is, you start him. Now, Alvin Kamara is so effective in both the running game and the passing game that if Alvin Kamara plays, I don't think you should start Latavius Murray. I don't think you can play both of them. But move on now to Michael Thomas. He's been great. He's been phenomenal. Not only do the Falcons give the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers given a good match, but his last 4 games have been great. When you look at what his last 4 games, what he has done, he had 11 catches for 182 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had 8 catches for 89 yards, and he had 9 catches for 131 yards. Then he had 11 catches off of just 11 targets, by the way, for 112 yards and a touchdown. He's a must start no matter what. Jared Cook. Jared Cook is a guy to consider as a 12 to 15 sort of range for tight ends. He caught all 3 of his targets last week when Breeze was throwing him the ball, and he's got back-to-back week with touchdowns. So Jared Cook is starting up on the rise. I don't trust him, but at the tight end position, play him in deep leagues for sure. Will Lutz, you got to start this guy for sure, and the Saints defense start. Lutz and the Saints defense are great plays for 2 reasons, and that is that they are both a good defense and a good kicker, and the Falcons give the 4th most points to kickers and the 8th most points to defenses. That is a great situation. Moving on now to the Falcons, sounds like Matt Ryan, sounds like he's going to be back. Now it's funny because before the Rams game, when he got hurt, and again, Matt Ryan, we'll talk about that situation in a second, but Matt Ryan, this guy's been phenomenal, the Rams. Before the Rams game, when he got hurt and didn't play the full game, so we're not going to count that game. You take that out. Every other game of the season, he has had at least 300 passing yards, as well as he's had 3+ touchdowns in 4 of his 6 games. So I'm telling you, Matt, this season, no matter what game it is, if Matt Ryan plays, you start him. That's where Matt Ryan is at right now. Devonta Freeman, I think you should consider this guy, but probably sit him. Here's what I gotta say right now. 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. That's what the Saints' tough defense is doing. In PPR leagues, he is often scoring 18+ fantasy points. So in PPR leagues, I'd start him as an RB2. But in standard, look elsewhere. The majority of this guy's value comes in the passing games, and it's just kind of difficult for me to justify playing a running back who has 0 rushing touchdowns on the year. So in standard leagues, I would look somewhere else, but in PPR leagues, he is certainly playable in a game against a team where they're probably going to need to score a lot of points. I'm having a hard time speaking here, but we'll continue on. We're just going to power through this. And Julio Jones, he certainly gets a boost from Mohamed Sanu leaving. Heck, we saw that last game, 12 targets, 10 catches, and 152 yards, and that was without Matt Ryan. You put a better quarterback in there, boom, this is going to be a fantastic week for him. Now, Calvin Ridley, he gets another boost with Matt Ryan back and Mohamed Sanu out. You got to play him. Austin Hooper's another guy you got to play. He's got 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games, and in that same stretch, he also had a 2-point conversion. Kicker Matt Bryant went down, is on the IR, so the new Atlanta kicker is Young-Ho Koo. I probably said that wrong, but it is spelt exactly how I pronounced it. I'm going like just straight how it says, but that is an interesting name. I would sit him. We just haven't seen any time from him. And the Falcons defense sit them since week 3. Their defense has combined for a -1 fantasy point. So that has been a very bad week for them. And that has been my breakdown for this game. So we'll move on and get talking about the Giants versus the Jets. All right, let's talk about the Giants and what they're going to be able to do this week versus the Jets. So we got Daniel Jones, sit this guy. He's had 2 great weeks. They were fun and exciting weeks. I love watching a young quarterback have very good games. But those were sandwiched around 5 very bad games. Games where he struggled, he looked just off. It was not great. And so I definitely think that you should probably be sitting this guy. In those 5 games, he averages 12 fantasy points. Top that in the fact they play the Jets. The Jets are not a great defense. They're very middle of the road. But you take a bad quarterback against a middle-of-the-road team, usually doesn't turn out too great. I definitely have to feel like you got better quarterback options out there. Saquon Barkley is a must-start. This guy is phenomenal. I love watching him play. You look at the game like on Monday, he had, 6 catches for 67 yards. Sorry, I had to check my notes there. And that's like that's the norm for him. It was just the week before. He had 8 catches for 79 yards. I don't care if you stop this guy in the ground game, which very few teams can do, by the way. Even if you manage that, he's going to get you in the passing game. He's going to get his. He is phenomenal. Start this guy. Moving on now to the wide receivers and Golden Tate with Sterling Shepard's extended absence, I guess is what we'll call it. His concussions and injuries has really held some maintained value for Golden Tate. Over the last 4 games, he's averaging about 6.5 catches a game. And so I think this is a good situation playing the Jets, allowing the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. I'd start him as a high-end wide receiver 3 or a flex play. Now Sterling Shepard is back in concussion protocol. It's very concerning. He is doubtful for this week. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder at this point, at what point in the season they just put him on the IR. In fact, that was something I talked to Rob about quite a bit. It doesn't seem like he's going to play this week, so I don't think you have to worry about that too much. Evan Ingram. This is a guy that I love. He's been very phenomenal. The Giants coach, one of their coaches, Pat Shurmur, even said that he's struggling with a foot injury. It's a bit of, I guess, just a sore foot or whatever, which happened in their Week 9 loss to the Cowboys. We're going to need to monitor that this week, but if he plays, he's been phenomenal. He is 6th in fantasy tight end scoring. He's a must start if he plays, but as always, monitor that injury. When coaches have to come out and talk about injuries, that's definitely something to watch. I know that a lot of times that's not a big injury, and the reason I'm saying that is that's not a big injury. A lot of people will go, well, I think he's fine, it's just a sore foot. But when the coach has to come out and talk about it, that begins to be maybe a little bit more something worth monitoring at this point. Their kicker, Aldrich Roses, he's actually been pretty darn good kicker. He's only averaging 4.5 points per game. He's got a very risky floor when you look at just very high and low and all over the place. So Aldrich Rosas, if you want to take a kicker this week with some pretty big risk, you want some high upside, that could be him. He could also be terrible. I personally am looking for another kicker this week. I am streaming. He's not the guy I'm going to go with. Now we look at the Giants. The Jets allowed the most points to opposing defenses, making even the below average Giants defense a defense you should consider. Maybe not for everyone to start this week, but if you're looking to, as always, take a gamble, that might be the team to go with. Flip on sides now to the Jets and Sam Darnold. It's funny, he comes back from mono and he makes a splash. They have a nice game against the Cowboys, but since then he has struggled. Now the Giants do allow the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, but I think that number is a bit skewed. That number will be worse. One game was versus Dwayne Haskins, who scored 0.5 fantasy points. He was pretty bad, and the other was versus the Cardinals. Chase Edmonds absolutely destroyed them on the ground game, and they didn't need to throw much, scoring only 7 points in a very lopsided game. So that number would actually be worse. I think the Giants' defense is one of the worst in the NFL. You take out those two games, the Giants are allowing 325 passing yards per game. Now, he carries a lot of risk, as do a lot of these guys. But if you're looking to plug and play a quarterback this week, to put a guy in, to take a shot, many of you who watch our channel are in 12 plus, 14 plus, 16 team leagues, whatever. He's a guy that you could plug and play this week. That there's some risk though. It's weird. I always feel like saying you could play him, but there's risks. Of course, it sounds a little bit obvious, but that's where he's at. I think he's got a fair amount of wide receivers to look at right now. But we're going to first talk about Le'Veon Bell. With his knee, underwent an MRI on Monday. Initially, our reports are that it is nothing serious, and as of Tuesday, as of right now, as I'm recording this, appears like he's going to be fine. He's going to play Sunday. He's been a bit of a disappointment this year. He's only got 51 rushing yards per game. That's probably mostly due to a bad 3.5 yards per carry. In fact, among qualifying players, he is currently receiving the 29th running back ranking from Pro Football Focus. Essentially, he's just not running the ball very well, one of the worst in the NFL. The Giants do allow the 10th most fantasy points to running backs, and he keeps his volume up there in standard. Currently, he has he currently keeps his volume or his value up there based on volume. Wow, totally misread that, but he does get hurt in the fact that he's only got 2 touchdowns, so his standard league value comes in as probably a running back 3. Last week he had a great matchup and he's still disappointed, so that's where I'm at with him right now. Of course, he gets that boost in PPR leagues though for sure, so make sure to consider that. I believe at this point he's on pace for 80 catches on the season. And that's something that Rob found out in his notes that I'm reading right now, just so you guys know, give him credit for that. But coming to the Giants, give him the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers. This could be a pretty good week for some of these guys here. If you're looking to take a risk, Crowder's got 3 big games this year. The other 5 games, he only averages 3 catches for 25 yards. But again, this is a great matchup. It's really difficult. Like we talked about in our waiver wire video, it feels like playing Russian roulette. Who's going to get the touchdown? Who's going to have the big day? Robbie Anderson or Crowder? They've even got Demaryius Thomas there. I don't trust any of these guys. Probably the guy that I would be playing, the one to start, would be Crowder. He gets a lot of targets, and not only does he get the PPR boost, but I feel like he's pretty safe. I would currently call him a wide receiver 4 or flex play. With injuries and bye weeks, though, he will creep into some lineups this week. As far as their tight ends, Ryan Griffin, Chris Herndon, I would sit both those guys. It's kind of a mess. Ryan Griffin has had back-to-back weeks with solid production. One week he had 4 catches, 66 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The other week he had 6 catches for 50 yards. But other than that, his entire career for Ryan Griffin has been bad. So I'm going to currently take that as an anomaly, as a fluke. Maybe that turns out to be who he is, and he turns out to be a good tight end, but I don't trust him right now. Their kicker, Sam Ficken, 5 times this season he has missed 2 or excuse me, 5 times this season he has had 2 or less fantasy points. So I think you got to sit this guy in. I would sit the Jets defense for sure. That defense has been less than great. So going to continue on now and talk about the Cardinals versus the Bucs. All right, so I want to talk first about the Cardinals offense and what they're going to be able to do this week versus the Buccaneers and Kyler Murray. I like him this week. Not only did he have a good week last week, he just last week against a tough 49ers defense, either the best or the second best defense in the NFL right now. He put up 23 fantasy points against them. It was a good day for him. Now he comes against the Bucs, giving the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Seems like a very good situation. I think you got to play Kyler Murray this week. I really do. It's funny. Coming in this season, I didn't think I was going to like Kyler Murray nearly as much as I did. So for those of you who liked him out of the draft, you've liked him a long time, good for you. You definitely, Cardinals seem like you got a good quarterback going into the future. The running back David Johnson in this situation, it's tough. They've got Chase Edmonds, they've got Kenyon Drake, and they've got David Johnson. There's a lot of confusion and concern there. Here's what we know right now, though. Chase Edmonds is doubtful and seriously looks like he's going to be out this week. That'll clear things up 1 week at a time, though. David Johnson is expected to play this week, and before he got hurt, he was averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. Even with Kenyon Drake there, I still have to play him as a low RB2 or flex play. There is concern because Kenyon Drake is there, but I'd also be very curious to see, was Kenyon Drake coming here and was a product, or coming to Arizona, and was very much a product of that offense being productive? Or was he really that effective that now he's going to bid for the job against David Johnson? I mean, the Miami Dolphins didn't want him. They got rid of him, and they really only picked him up because of injuries to their running backs, the Cardinals did. So I definitely have to feel like he's going to mostly take his role back, David Johnson will. Yes, there's a lot of concern there, but looking into it right now, I feel like if David Johnson plays, you should start him. Again, I would maybe be more hesitant, but with 6 teams gone this week and injuries to a lot of running backs, you toss in disappointment running backs and busts, I definitely think he's a guy you got to play. Kenyon Drake, if David Johnson is out, Kenyon Drake becomes a must start. In PPR leagues, if David Johnson is playing, I think you could consider Kenyon Drake as maybe a flex play or a very low-end RB2. For those of you in deep leagues and bad running back situations, he is a possibility to play if David Johnson plays, but otherwise he definitely makes me nervous. Hopefully that makes sense. It is a very confusing situation right now. I can't wait till it's all cleared up, but that probably won't happen for a while. This could be a running back by committee system going through next year. Who knows? But continue now to Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. I like both these guys as wide receiver 3s, and here's why. They're both great wideouts, or good wideouts, and they've got a great matchup against the Bucs, giving the most fantasy points to wide receivers. They've struggled a little bit. They haven't been phenomenal the last few games, but with a good matchup, I think that they can be played. I would sit the Cardinals tight ends and start the kicker Zane Gonzalez. He has scored 10 or more fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games, as well as I would sit the Cardinals defense. So now we get to take a look at the Bucs offense and what they've got going on there. Jameis Winston, start this guy. Cardinals give the most fantasy points to opposing QBs, and since week 3, he is averaging 27 fantasy points per game. I'm going to say this every week so I can cover myself from the negative comments. Me and Rob always do. I'm not going to talk here about how great of a quarterback Jameis Winston is. I genuinely think he's a bad NFL quarterback. He's got a lot of struggles. But fantasy numbers are there, and I'm not here to argue with the fantasy numbers. They say the stats don't lie, and I believe it. Start this guy this week in a good matchup. We've got Ronald Jones Jr. and Peyton Barber. I'm going to safely say to sit these guys. Of course, that goes completely against the fact that the running back position is thin. There's 6 teams on buys. There's injuries. There's all this stuff. If you're going to play one of them, play Ronald Jones Jr., but I don't like either of these guys. Cardinals do give it the 15th fewest fantasy points to running backs. Both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, start these guys. I don't even need to talk about this. If you're even considering sitting them, what is wrong with you, honestly? And then the Bucs tight ends, I would sit them and start the kicker Matt Gay. Cardinals give the 9th most fantasy points to opposing kickers. He's actually been a pretty good kicker this year. And I would sit the Buccaneers defense. That is my wrap up for this game. Now we'll continue on with the next game. All right, here we've got the Colts versus the Dolphins. I want to talk about the Dolphins. Right now it sounds like Ryan Fitzpatrick will be their quarterback this week. He did have a good week last week versus the Jets, but other than that, he has struggled tremendously. And in fact, that team is currently 30th, scoring only 12.9 points per game. And of course, they just lose Preston Williams for the rest of the season. And of course, they lost Kenyon Drake. To me, at that point, you lose probably two of your best offensive players. I don't think that, and of course, they lost Mark Walton. Almost forgot about him. Oh my goodness. I think this is a situation you got to avoid. I wouldn't play any quarterback that's playing in this situation right now. As far as the running backs go, Kalen Ballage, he's going to get the start with Mark Walton out and Kenyon Drake moved on over to Arizona. He's going to get the play, but do you trust this guy? I don't. 2.0 yards per carry. I love what Rob put here in his notes because he's the one who did the research for this game. It says, Kalen Ballage has been playing awful this year. Is it the offensive line's fault or is it his fault? It doesn't matter because bad is bad. And that's exactly the case. The production hasn't been there. Every once in a while, you're going to start a guy who has bad production and suddenly, boom, he'll break out. That's just not the case. I don't think going to be this week. That very rarely happens. 9 times out of 10, though, it doesn't. Think back to Ty Johnson in that situation. Owner of him grabbed him, thought he was going to be this great fill-in for Kerryon Johnson, and it wasn't. Because sometimes when you're bad, you're bad. And that's just what I feel like we're looking at here with Kalen Ballage. Devontae Parker gets a boost. The absence of Preston Williams means he's going to get more targets as well as more attention from defenses. I could see a lot of garbage time points from him. I would play him as a wide receiver 3, even though I don't love this offense right now. Their tight end, Mike Gesicki. Now, this is a guy who was very highly touted. He was a second-round pick, and people loved him coming in the draft. Has thus far been a disappointment, except last Sunday had 6 catches for 95 yards. This is really what the Dolphins expected him to be when they took him. Now, versus the Colts, allowing the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends, and the fact that he's going to hopefully, most likely, see a lot of targets this week because Preston Williams is out, I think he comes in as a sleeper play with a high ceiling and a low floor. If you're plug and playing a tight end this week, this might be the guy to do it if you're going for that upside. I would sit their kicker and sit the Dolphins defense. We got that out of the way. We can talk about the Colts situation and Jacoby Brissett. Now, ESPN's Chris Mortensen came out and said that Jacoby Brissett, at least as far as what we know right now, strained his MCL. In fact, he's got a chance to play this week. I'd imagine he probably won't. They've got a veteran backup in Brian Hoyer, and they're playing a team in the Dolphins who is awful and also lost some good players. Or a few of their players, 3 of their players on offense to be exact. You have to imagine that they're probably going to play without him. T.Y. Hilton is out. Paris Campbell is out. I have to imagine this is going to be a very bad team for that, or very bad game for that team as a whole. The one guy who's going to benefit from is going to be Marlon Mack. The Dolphins give the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. He's averaging the 2nd most carries per game. This guy's going to see 20-plus carries. I could see him breaking 100 yards. He's got a very high-end RB2. That's what I think he is this week. Now, another running back in that offense is, excuse me there, look like an idiot, but Nyheim Hines. With all those wide receivers out and that whole situation, he could see an uptick in targets, but he's had such a significantly small and reduced role this year that I seriously don't think you can start him, even if that turns out to be true and even if he does manage to get more targets. A guy you got to play is Zach Pascal in Week 10 versus Miami, allowing the 12th most points to wide receivers. That's a good matchup, and with T.Y. Hilton's calf injury and Paris Campbell being out, he's going to see a lot of targets, and he's really come on lately. We've talked about this in waiver-wire videos. We've talked about this in videos past, so I'm not going to waste your time. I think he comes in as a wide receiver 3. He's going to get a lot of attention from defenses because he's really the only wide receiver on that team right now. But he's got high upside, and he's played very well lately. Their tight ends, Eric Ebron and Jack Doyle. I could easily see them getting a few extra targets with Campbell and Hilton out, but they're still splitting targets. They really just downgrade each other. Neither of those guys separates themselves enough to start. I'd like to know if you guys are considering starting them. Leave a comment down below. We'll work through it. We'll talk about what your options are, and we'll see what you can do this week. I don't like them. Moving on to the kicker, Adam Vinatieri. Man, he missed another kick. 10 missed kicks on the year. It is awful. What do you do at this point? He's had a great career, but seems like it's probably time for him to retire. He's actually currently the oldest player in the NFL, so that would probably another sign that he should retire. Colts defense. Now, the Dolphins give the 2nd most fantasy points to defenses, so I would start them this week. And that's what you need to know about, honestly, probably the toilet bowl of Week 10, which is the Dolphins versus the Colts. Not bashing on either team, but both teams are missing a lot of players that they were once using in their offenses. So move on down to the next game. All right, now let's talk about the Panthers versus the Packers. I'd like to talk about the Packers this week. Now, they're coming off against a week where they seriously struggled versus the Chargers. But I think every week Out of every NFL season, there's a team that disappoints, that just plays completely out of normal for them. I know that there was a lot of news that they were, having this long flight over and their flight was delayed, and that there was just, I think, a lot of distractions for them, and that may have explained some of their struggle. Certainly not all of it. I was impressed with the Chargers last week versus the Packers, but my point being, I think the Packers are going to recover just fine this week. Aaron Rodgers is averaging 22 fantasy points per game, which is really impressive when you consider that includes Davante Adams being gone for many games, and the fact that he started what many people would consider started the season very slow. So he's a must start this week. Aaron Jones is probably the start of the week, at least in my opinion. Not only has he been phenomenal, he's averaging 23 fantasy points per game. This man is finding the end zone left and right. He is a scoring machine. You couple that with a great matchup against the Panthers, giving up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Aaron Jones is probably the #1 fantasy running back this week, at least in my personal opinion. I like him this week. This is a good matchup. His backup, Jamal Williams, he also benefits from it being in a good matchup, and in PPR leagues, he has had at least 14 fantasy points every game since week 6. But he's averaging just 4 carries and 8 touches a game in the last 3 games. He's relied on getting a couple of touchdowns over the last few weeks that I feel like the majority of the season, 9 times out of 10, so to speak, is going to go to Aaron Jones. I don't feel like you can trust him to start him. Davante Adams is back. It's funny. He has 2 100-plus yard games, and he's missed most of the season this year, so he's actually been very effective when he has played. In his first game back, he saw 11 targets and 7 catches. Davante Adams, start this dude against the Panthers, who are, by the way, giving up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. The only other wide receiver there to consider is Allen Lazard. Of course, he also benefits from the good matchup, and he's good for about 3 to 5 catches and 40 to 50 receiving yards a game. That's really pretty much exactly what he's done the last 3 games in a row. I wonder if the Panthers are able to put up some points. That number could get boosted for Lazard, but again, they do lean on their wow. They very heavily lean on their running game and the use of their backs. Not only have they been working Jamal Williams in at least a little bit recently, again, 8 touches isn't much, but that is a little bit. And they love Aaron Jones. They run the ball with him a lot, and they've been using him in the passing game a lot. It was just, a couple weeks ago, he had over 100 receiving yards. Man, this guy has been phenomenal. So you just wonder with Davante Adams and all those other weapons, how much volume or how much room there is for him to have a huge day. I think he's a safe floor, though. That's what you need to know about him. Jimmy Graham, he's really hurt now that Davante Adams is back, who I already mentioned, comes back in his first game, gets 11 targets and 7 catches. Panthers also give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. I would definitely consider sitting Jimmy Graham this week. I would also sit the Packers defense and Mason Crosby. Now we got all that out of the way, let's talk about the Panthers side of the ball. Kyle Allen comes out, has a monster debut in his first start, but after that he's averaged just 11 fantasy points per game over the last 5 games, and the Packers give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Plain and simple, I don't trust Kyle Allen to start this week. I think he's a good game manager, but that's sort of just the role he's going to have this week, at least from what I'm projecting. Christian McCaffrey, start this guy. He's a monster of a running back. I'm not even going to waste our time. Let's not get into it. Start him. He's phenomenal. DJ Moore, 10 targets, 7 catches, 101 yards last week versus the Titans, who are not a bad defense. I feel like you got to play DJ Moore this week. Now, Packers do give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. There is a lot of inconsistency with DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, so it makes me very nervous. But I definitely still feel like you have to play him. He gets his volume of targets, and if the Panthers are going to win this game against the Packers, I think it's going to be through DJ Moore helping, get a couple of first downs, moving those chains forward, and I think he's going to be an important part of that game. So that's DJ Moore. And really his only problem with him is he's got 1 receiving touchdown on the year. That was in week 3. If he could get some more touchdowns, he could be a very effective fantasy wide receiver. But until that happens, I limit him in his value, or at least he is limited in his value, and I think you should not start him with quite as much excitement. Curtis Samuel, since week 3, he's a guy who hasn't scored a touchdown. This guy has 3 touchdowns on the year. Excuse me on what I just said. Let me completely restart. I just totally read my notes out of order for some reason. He's got 3 touchdowns on the year, and since week 3, if he hasn't scored a touchdown, he scores just 8 fantasy points per game in PPR leagues. If he doesn't score a touchdown, you can't start him. In standard leagues, I don't think you can start him because he's not getting enough touchdowns. In PPR leagues, I don't think you can start him because they're just better options. We're getting more points. Sit him. Greg Olsen, I think he's a guy you should play this week. Now, since week 4 and onward, he has totaled just 110 receiving yards, and he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 3. He has struggled. But I think this could very well be the week that he could bounce back. Now, start him with the expectation that he will be a tight end 10 to 15, 16 range. He's not going to be a phenomenal tight end, but Packers give the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends, and as I mentioned with DJ Moore, I think him in the passing game, getting those chains moving and helping out in the red zone, I think he's going to be another key to the Panthers winning that game, if they do win that game. But their tight end, or excuse me, their kicker, Joey Sly, sit this guy and sit the Panthers defense now. Here's the thing, they've had some really good fantasy days. They put some really big numbers, but they're very inconsistent, and I don't see them forcing Aaron Jones and Aaron Rodgers to cough up the football and get turnovers. That's not going to happen from the Packers. Matt LaFleur's a good coach. They're a well-coached team. There's a good offense, and turnovers are what give them good numbers, good fantasy days to opposing defenses. That's not going to happen for the Panthers. Their inconsistency is going to probably just result in a bad week this week. But that's my wrap-up now for the Panthers versus Packers. All right, now we're going to talk about the Rams versus the Steelers. Let's get started with Jared Goff and the Rams side. And I don't like Jared Goff this week a whole lot. That Steelers team has improved a lot recently. Since I believe week 3, when they had the addition of Minkah Fitzpatrick, plus you had the development of Watt and Devin Bush, that team has really started to turn things around. Now get this, minus a bad game versus Phillip Rivers and the Chargers, really the other 4 games since then, the Steelers are allowing only 172 passing yards per game. You take their burner deep wide receiver and Brandon Cooks out of the equation. Their offensive line has played bad, and Todd Gurley has struggled because of it, really limiting their ability to run play action. For me, he ranks outside of the top 10 this week. Jared Goff is a good quarterback. He's got Cooper Kupp. He's got some weapons, right? You can play him, but he's not going to be great. For me, he's outside of the top 10. That's where I'd put him. Todd Gurley's not as efficient, 3.9 yards per carry. So far, it hasn't really been his knee so much. His knee's been fine. It's been just terrible offensive line that has just been a massive struggle. But he does have 7 touchdowns in 7 games. And I tell you what, he gets the goal line carries in a good offense, and it keeps him as a solid RB2 play. That's for sure. Moving on to the wide receivers, more than a solid play. This is an elite play. Cooper Kupp has been phenomenal. He is 4th in wide receiver scoring. Like we said at the beginning of the season, I remember we were coming into this season and there was a lot of concern with his health and people saying he's going to be slower this year, he's going to be worse this year, he's going to struggle this year. And I came out in our bold predictions video and said Cooper Kupp would be better than he was last year. Everyone said I was insane. I was right. Start this guy as a wide receiver 1. Robert Woods has been a disappointment this year, but with Brandon Cooks out in concussion protocol, you could see his usage and his targets increase. For me, he comes in as a mid to low end wide receiver 3. Josh Reynolds. Josh Reynolds is an interesting situation. I'd probably put him as a wide receiver 4. He's still behind a lot of talent at this point. Brandon Cooks, again, much like Sterling Shepard, on concussion protocol, hasn't been cleared yet. He does have a concerning history of concussions, as Rob and his notes have just notified me, but especially in recent seasons, he's a bit of a specialist. For me, I don't think he's going to play this week. I think they're going to sit him this week and just let him heal and see what's going on. I think the NFL is probably going to keep him on that concussion protocol. Another tight end, Gerald Everett. The Steelers give the 9th most fantasy points to tight ends, and he had a stretch of 3 games in 4, so 3 of 4 games where he was very productive, and he was a very good start. Now, you take Cooks out. I think he ranks as a 10 to 12 tight end this week as a sneaky solid play. Start Greg Zuerlein. He's a top 5 kicker this year. He's been just a weekly stud of a start in the Rams. Now they added Ramsey. Has been a huge boost to this to that defense, and I think they're a decent play. Probably about as strong as they were last season. If you're looking for a plug and play this week, you can go Rams. I don't love them, but I do like them. That's, I guess, my wrap up for that. Nothing phenomenal or too groundbreaking to say, but that's what it is. It is what it is. So we've got Mason Rudolph now. Even in good matchups, his numbers hasn't been there. I just don't think you can play this guy against the Rams who just added Jalen Ramsey. No way, man. I'm going to avoid that situation. James Conner. The Steelers are leaving. Excuse me, Rob. I'm going to kill you, dude. Your notes are terrible here. No, but here's what we know about James Conner at this point. Initial reports really indicate that he's going to miss another week. Watch this and see later on. Right now I'm producing this video. It's Tuesday, and we just don't know enough. we're going to update you in our Friday injury update video, but you're just going to have to wait and see at this point. There's definitely a chance that he won't be playing this week. There's a chance that he will be playing. Could go either way. My personal thought is that he probably won't, but who knows. Jalen Samuels in another situation. He had another interesting situation. He had 8 carries for just 10 yards. That's 1.3 yards per carry. That's brutal. And yet, it's really weird because he just went off 13 catches for 73 yards. If James Conner is out, he becomes a solid PPR high-end running back too. And that's Rob's research, not mine. So just reading that out there. If that turns out not to be true, you guys can get mad at him. But and I do stand by that. I do stand behind that. He's the one who found these stats and everything. But the volume that he'll get in the passing game and the amount of carries, and if James Conner is out, where it really counts is that maybe he'll get some extra red zone stuff. They will lean on Trey Edmonds as maybe their main pure runner. He did 12 carries for 73 yards, but I don't trust him to start if James Conner is out. I think the best thing for fantasy points and feeling safe about what's really going to happen there is if James Conner comes back, and then you can play him. Now, Juju Smith-Schuster, fact of the matter is he misses Ben Roethlisberger. He wants his quarterback. He is very talented, but with Mason Rudolph, he's just not able to get it done. Now he faces Jalen Ramsey and a Rams defense that is much improved. I don't think this is going to be a good week for him. For me, he comes in as a wide receiver 3. He's still Juju Smith-Schuster. You still have to play him, but you can't be too excited about it. It doesn't look like a great situation. Vance McDonald, he's averaging 25.1 yards per game. Sit this guy. I mean, that's just the production hasn't been there. Sit their kicker, Chris Boswell. Enough for the Steelers defense. They've had 6 consecutive games scoring double-digit fantasy points. Now the Rams, who allow the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses, it's going to be a bit of a showdown to see what happens here. I would start the Steelers defense as probably a 9 to 12 range for defenses there. But that's my wrap-up. We're going to move on now to the Cowboys versus the Vikings. All right, I'm going to talk about the Vikings first, and let's talk about what they can do against this Cowboys team. Kirk Cousins. Cowboys allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. It makes me nervous, but Cousins has 11 touchdown passes in the last 4 games. For me, I would call him a low-end start. Not a guy I'm excited about, but a guy that I think could have some numbers this week. I don't think he's a terrible play. They haven't played a lot of great quarterbacks this year. The Cowboys haven't, so I think that number is slightly skewed by easy competition. But when they did play good quarterbacks, which was Aaron Rodgers and Carson Wentz, they've held them to a combined 1 touchdown pass. So there's a lot of nerves there. I still think he's a playable quarterback, but not a guy I'm excited about. Dalvin Cook is a guy you got to start. Last week was an off week for him, but even in that off week, he still had 21 carries for 71 yards, and he also added 4 catches for 45 yards on 7 targets. So his off week, he still went over 100 yards. Dalvin Cook is a must start. Adam Thielen, he's also a guy you got to start. Dallas Cowboys give the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. He's got 6 touchdowns in 7 games. If he's playing, if he's healthy, he's a guy to play every week. That's just the way it is. Stephon Diggs. Now, if you take out last week's terrible weeks, he has been phenomenal. In 4 of his last 5 games, excluding last week, he has gone over 108 yards 4 of 5 times. He's been phenomenal. For me, he comes in as a low wide receiver 3. He's got high upside, but very high low side, very high floor, or very low floor. Oh my goodness. Let me rephrase that. Stephon Diggs, he's got huge upside. He could have a huge day. He could go over 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. He could also see 3 targets, 1 catch, and 13 yards. I mean, this guy is very volatile in his fantasy value. I don't trust him, but I also know that if you don't play him as a wide receiver 3 or a flex play, if you don't put him in your lineup, he could also have a monster day. So you have to at least consider playing him for sure. And we've got Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph. They're still really working out who is the guy. Irving Smith is continuing to work in and chip away at Kyle Rudolph and grow his impact on that offense, but he's still not doing enough to make him fantasy viable. I wouldn't play him this week. Sit Dan Bailey and sit the Vikings defense. The Cowboys actually give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses, so that's not a great situation to be involved in. Now we go to Dak Prescott. Sit this guy. The Vikings give up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and Dak Prescott's been actually not great this year. He has 15 touchdown passes on the year, but did you know that 7 of those 15 came against the Giants? Almost half of his touchdown passes came against the awful Giants defense. Other than that, he has not been great. You got to start Ezekiel Elliott. He has either scored a touchdown or had 100-plus rushing yards, or both, in every single game this year. He's been phenomenal. The Vikings give the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs, but that didn't matter. He played the Eagles, and he shredded the Eagles' run defense that's arguably better than the Vikings. Amari Cooper, start. This guy, he looks good. He's a great wide receiver, and the Vikings give the 11th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. Now, the Vikings' defense have given the 11th most fantasy points to wide receivers. It is important to note that that number is a bit skewed. And here's why. They've played Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Mohamed Sanu, Devontae Adams, Tyrell Williams, Allen Robinson, Sterling Shepard, Marvin Jones, Terry McLaurin, Tyreek Hill, and Sammy Watkins. They have faced a plethora of stud wide receivers. So I don't think they're quite that bad. I would call them middle of the line. They seem very inconsistent at this point. A bad game, or one bad quarter versus the Packers, and then they were fine against them. You go against the Chiefs and Matt Moore, and you just get shredded by their wide receivers. It's very weird. Interesting situation. Michael Gallup, for me, he comes in as a low wide receiver 3 play. Now, in 3 of his 6 games have been very good, 3 have been very bad. You couple that, he's got to go against Trey Waynes, probably one of the best, if not the best, number 2 corner in the NFL. This could be a tough matchup for him. Jason Witten, Vikings give the 13th most fantasy points to tight ends, but they have placed Austin Hooper, Darren Waller, Evan Ingram, Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert, Travis Kelce. They have played a plethora of good tight ends. So I don't think this is going to be a very good week for him. He has already struggled quite a bit. I would sit Jason Witten. As far as the Cowboys go, I'd start their kicker, Brett Maher. In the last 3 weeks, he has scored 14, 15, and 16 fantasy points. So I would play him, and I would sit the Cowboys defense. I tell you what, that is, of all the games this week, yes, I'm a Vikings fan, but of all the games this week, this is the game I am the most excited to watch. And so I'm curious to see how my Vikings do after a bad loss to the Chiefs. They got to recover, but this is going to be a tough game for sure. Let's move on now to, I believe, what is the final game of this video that we got to talk about for this week, which is the Seahawks versus the 49ers, and Rob did the research for that. Now we're going to talk about the Seahawks versus the 49ers, and I think you got to play Russell Wilson this week. Not only does he have a quarterback rating of 118 and 22 touchdown passes on the year, you couple that with 3 rushing touchdowns. He's on pace for 39 passing touchdowns plus 5 rushing. Now, 49ers defense is great, but Kyler Murray showed us last week that you can move the ball against that 49ers defense. And actually, twice last week we saw that sort of thing. Lamar Jackson showed us you can move the ball against New England's defense. I guess no matter how good your defense is, an MVP type quarterback like Russell Wilson, I think can come in and have a good day. You got to play him. Chris Carson's another guy you got to play. He's averaging 105 total yards per game. Again, this is a very tough 49ers defense, but do you have a better option than him when you consider bye weeks and injuries? No, you don't. Absolutely no way. This guy comes in as a running back to play this week. Again, it's a tough matchup, but with so much usage and volume, there's no way you can sit him. Wide receiver Tyler Lockett. For us, he comes in most weeks as a wide receiver 1. His metrics are insane. Over the last 2 seasons, he's had a quarterback rating generated. So when he's targeted, he generates a quarterback rating of 139 and 158 is what he's done over the last 2 seasons. On his career, it's 131, those efficiency marks. Nobody else. I've never seen anybody else do it. In fact, last year when he was targeted with catchable balls, he didn't drop a single one of them. So he's phenomenal. Again, most weeks he's a wide receiver 1. This tough matchup brings him down to a wide receiver 2, but you're still going to play him. Josh Gordon is now playing for the Seattle Seahawks, and I cannot wait to see what this guy does. I am excited. Oh, man, this is going to be great. For that reason, I still wouldn't play him, but I'll be watching him. I'll be monitoring him. For that reason, I would sit Metcalf. We absolutely pushed DK Metcalf last week, and we were right. But this week he's a wide receiver 4. When you talk about all the different weapons that they've got there, Tyler Lockett and now Josh Gordon, and then in a tough matchup, I don't think you can trust him this week. Their tight end, Jacob Hollister, he may grow into what Will Disley was. In fact, he did have a good 2-touchdown week last week, but take that away, in the last 3 games, he's averaging just 3 catches for 25 yards over the last 3 games, So for right now, I don't trust him. Jason Myers is only hitting 70% of his field goals. I would sit him this week in the Seahawks. Their defense, San Francisco only allows the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses, and Seattle's actually only averaging 1.6 sacks a game. For that reason, Seattle Seahawks defense, I would sit them this week. Come on now to the 49ers and talk about that offense. Jimmy Garoppolo, Seattle gives the 11th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And I like him as a medium play this week. Not a great play, but just a very average play this week, and I'll tell you why. Heading into last week, heading into his Halloween matchup, the Halloween weekend or whatever, he's at 1.3 touchdown passes per game and 212 passing yards per game. That's what he was doing. He was very Jekyll and Hyde all over the place. He had a big game last game, of course, giving me a lot more confidence in what he's been able to do now that Emmanuel Sanders is on that team. He's really started to get cooking, really started to get working with that offense. I have a lot more confidence in him as a medium, average, or a low-end play. I don't think he's got huge upside this week. Tevin Coleman, he's a low-end RB2 play. He's got 6 touchdowns in the last 5 games. As much as I feel insecure and uncomfortable with that backfield, the touchdowns are the touchdowns, and so many people are so desperate at this point. I think many of you should be playing him. There are a few who, of course, have great backs, but you get the point. Now, Matt Breida is an interesting situation. For me, he is a running back 3. He's on the bubble. He's got huge upside, but I'm going to sit him. That's what I would say. I lean more towards Tevin Coleman as the guy. Now, Emmanuel Sanders, 2 games, 2 touchdowns so far. His rapport and the way he's been playing with Jimmy Garoppolo has been phenomenal. Start this guy. He's been great. I would call him probably the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on that team, a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. That's what I would say he is. George Kittle is a guy you got to start. He started off the season slow. He's picked it up a bit. You got to start him at tight end. He is a stud. Absolutely play him. And Robbie Gould is a great opportunity. Probably not a great kicker. I would play him this week, not with huge expectations, but I definitely think you can start him. And the San Francisco defense, I think they're too good to sit. I do love that Seattle offense and everything they're doing. But they do make mistakes. They do have struggles. They are vulnerable. We've seen other teams shut down or beat up on that Seattle offense. I think San Francisco could have a bad week this week, but they're also too good to sit. They could have a monster week, so I do like the 49ers this week. I would play that defense. And that is my breakdown there for that game and everything that you guys need to know this week. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Your support has been absolutely fantastic, especially our Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. I want to give you a quick little update as to why Rob is not here. I already mentioned it sort of at the beginning of the video, but my sister, and Rob's my dad actually, for those of you who don't know, so his daughter, my sister, she is at the Children's Hospital getting testing. They're testing her brain and running a lot of MRIs and all these different things, fancy medical terms that I don't understand, so they can try to figure out where her epilepsy that she's been struggling with since she was 8, very bad epilepsy that has actually had her to the ER many nights where she can't breathe and just terrible stuff. I feel so bad for her. But just an update, they're down there. They're going to be down there for a few days. They're getting some cool tests done, some really rare tests, in fact. I don't know if you guys, like if you're religious, if you pray or not, I would love some prayer. Our family would love some prayer. Sounds like tomorrow she's going to be getting a test that is very dangerous, actually. Sounds like it's this super huge machine that they go in and they're able to scan your brain, and it's far more accurate than any other machine. But the FDA actually hasn't even approved this for use outside of very rare cases. You have to have epilepsy for over 6 years to the point where they're saying that's starting to become dangerous and could harm you or even take your life away. Like, as you have to be very bad situation as far as your epilepsy goes for them to use this machine. But I guess she qualifies at this point, which is good news, bad news situation, I guess. You win some, you lose some. And she's going to be having this very dangerous test done tomorrow. So if you guys could pray for that, that would be great. You guys' support has been fantastic. Everything that you guys do for us is amazing. We couldn't do it without you. As always, you guys have a great day, and God bless.